So Matthew 4, 1 through 11. If you remember correctly, the Spirit is what drives Jesus out into the desert. And out in the desert, then, Jesus fasts for 40 days, and he was hungry, which is probably one of the purest things that the gospel has ever said, right? Jesus is hungry after fasting for 40 days, and then the devil shows up. Devil shows up and tempts Jesus in three ways. Tempts him to turn stones into bread. Tempts him to throw himself off the parapet of the temple to show the wonder of the angels lifting him up. And then Satan specifically tempts Jesus to bow down before him, Satan, and worship him in order to receive authority over the kingdoms of the earth. What I find fascinating about Matthew's arrangement of these temptations, which is different than they are in Luke, by the way. Matthew arranges them in ways that play exactly on the three gifts given to the Son of Man in Daniel 7:14. So if you go to Daniel 7:14, the first gift is authority, the second gift is glory, and the third gift is the kingdom, or a kingdom. And if you look at the way Matthew arranges the temptations, they're related. So the temptation to use your authority for yourself. Jesus can speak with God's voice, is what Matthew is telling us. And so as God brought something out of nothing on the first days of creation, Jesus could turn stones to bread because he's hungry. But he doesn't. Jesus resists that. The temptation to glory, temptation to be carried around Jerusalem on the backs of angels. Jesus resists that as well. And interesting to me, the temptation to the kingdom. It was widely understood in the first century that the kingdoms of the nations were somehow under the control of evil powers. Different Jewish texts work that out in different ways, but that seemed to have been the folk belief. And Matthew seems to be touching on that belief here, that somehow the kingdoms of the world were under the power of Satan. And that if Jesus really wanted the kingdom promised in Daniel 7:14, he was going to have to do business with Satan. Matthew is making a number of important points here. One, Jesus really has the things that we're waiting for. The marks of the Messiah that many of the Jews would have identified as coming with the Messiah. These are things Jesus has. And he's going to use them in ways that were completely unexpected. That's the second thing Matthew is trying to remind his audience, because not everyone was waiting for a spiritual Messiah. There were people waiting for a Messiah who was going to establish a real earthly kingdom that had spiritual attributes to it, but a real earthly kingdom. Jesus does not use any of these powers for himself, and Jesus does not follow the ways of the world in revealing his his messianic nature. The gifts are entirely at the service of the Father's mission. And so we can see then the way Matthew is developing this encounter and transformation in this particular text. The encounter is with the Spirit, not actually with Satan. It's the Spirit that drives Jesus out into the desert. Satan just happens to be waiting out there because in folk belief, the desert was the haunt of evil spirits. Birds, owls, actually, often represent evil spirits in the Old Testament. Anyone who's had me in class knows birds are bad, right? Mark's gospel, I think, has a fascinating little detail that wild animals came and waited upon him. Matthew changes that to angels came and waited upon him. But the fact that these wild beings out in the desert, which were often associated with evil, were now under the power of Jesus, is a sign that Jesus is doing something different. That the Spirit driving him out into the desert was not to send him to the mercy of these wild and potentially evil beings, but rather to bring them to bring him on board with God's mission. The transformation is what happens when one remains in the Spirit then. So what Matthew is showing us is that in the midst of these temptations that would have been very easy for someone who believes himself to be the Son of Man to give into, if one stays in the Spirit, one can resist the kind of counterfeit fulfillment of divine plan that these temptations represented. And so the lesson then, our takeaway lesson from the temptation in the desert, the same grace is operative in us. Whatever gifts we think we might have, whatever skills the Lord has given us, whatever context the Lord has given us, these are things given us for mission. Like Jesus, we can't give in to counterfeit methods of fulfilling them, ways of using them just for our own pleasure or wealth or aggrandizement, but rather to seek out the divine mission and follow and use these gifts for that.